Now, a lot of things happened, and it's hard to summarize them quickly, you know? So I tried to just put together a list of the major institutions that were formed during the war to carry out, to create this innovation system that was key to winning the war. You have them listed here. Most of these are still ongoing, and it's still ongoing. I put the infinity sign. The other ones, there are those that lasted only for the war, or in the case of servo mechanisms lab, you know, it morphed into something else. The consequences of all of these continue, of course. David Noble is a scholar who's written a lot about that. I'll just move right ahead. He just explains basically how large it was. Indeed, it's huge, and the government replaced the great industries as the orchestrator of this kind of research during the war. Something else was done during the war, which is the planning for the post-war period, setting up these military monetary institutions. And these two things are not usually put together, but I think they should be. Because as we can see now, if there hadn't been the development of these cyborg sciences, if there had not been the initial theorization of cybernetics and the creation of computers and the groundwork laid for the vast computer network we have now, then all of these military and monetary institutions would not have taken the form that they have now. So really the two things have to be put together. The technological and the political have to be put together into technopolitics if you want to understand the contemporary world. So basically what's mainly being talked about here is the economic institutions, very important Export-Import Bank, this Lend-Lease program. This is an amazing story. I thought I corrected this. This should be 1941. What did the Lend-Lease program do? It lent Britain war materiel, and then at the end of the war, the Americans demanded the money for it because it was actually just a lease. And this is what broke the back of Great Britain. This caused the, this was actually the reason that Britain abandoned its empire. This is why India's independence occurred. This is why the British pulled out of Malaysia, all that because they had no money. And this was done deliberately by the United States to end the British influence, and so that the United States would become the hegemonic power. That's the way it is in empire, you know. Bretton Woods currency regime, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, we talked about these things, the GATT, which later became the WTO, the Marshall Plan, which of course gave birth to the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Pretty fascinating when you look into the details. It took a long, this is something to understand. This is a great book, by the way, done in the 1970s using Freedom of Information Act and so on. You can get a copy of that on the internet, and I'll put one in the box. They found things that are really fascinating. This July 24th, 1941 memorandum to the President of the Department of State, coming from what? From the Council of Foreign Relations, which is an elite group of businessmen, a major business organization of business elites in the United States, which existed long before and which saw the First World War as a lost opportunity to set up a world market that would be favorable to the United States. So during the Second World War, this group actually had itself inducted into the government, into Roosevelt's government, and had itself charged with planning the post-war economy. So the business elites of the United States during the Second World War planned the post-war economy. And they immediately, you can see that they had ideas about it, because in 1941, they drafted this memorandum to the President of the Department of State outlining the Council on Foreign Relations' view of the national interests. To prevent alterations in the United States economy, alterations like the Great Depression, the Council had, quote, gone on to discover what elbow room the American economy needed in order to survive without major readjustments, in other words, without a new depression. This living space, that's the Lebensraum idea, had to have the basic raw materials needed for the nation's industry, as well as, quote, the fewest possible stresses making for its own disintegration, such as unwieldy export surpluses or severe shortages of consumer goods. The extensive studies and discussions of the council groups determined that, as a minimum, most of the non-German world, what they called the grand area was needed. And of course, this grand area, that was when they were still planning for a face-off with Germany where there wouldn't be a victor in war. Later, it was included to obviously include the German world. In its final form, it consisted of the Western Hemisphere, the United Kingdom, the remainder of the British Commonwealth and Empire, and the Dutch East Indies, China, and Japan itself, which is effectively the sphere of American influence after the Second World War. So you see that during the crisis, elite groups become part of the state. And this is something we will see again in the 1970s. It's really quite fascinating. The other thing where the Council on Foreign Relations had extensive influence was in, this is a Marshall Plan. This is like a poster for the Marshall Plan. You know, so it shows all the different flags of all the countries involved in the Marshall Plan with this idea, whatever the weather, we must move together, and you've got the American flag as the weather vane, you know, that's going to orient the direction of the productive windmill. And so this is another State Department memorandum, EB 334, pretty famous thing. So in the event of an American-British victory, much would have to be done toward reshaping the world, particularly Europe. In this, the Grand Area Organization should prove useful. During an interim period of readjustment and reconstruction, the Grand Area might be an important stabilizing factor in the world's economy. Very likely, the institutions developed for the integration of the Grand Area would yield useful experience in meeting European problems, and perhaps it would be possible simply to interweave the economies of European countries into that of the Grand Area. At the end of the recommendation EB 34, the Economic and Financial Group, in other words, the Council on Foreign Relations, outlined the key topics for the future study on integrating the Grand Area. Leading the list were financial measures, creation of international financial institutions to stabilize currencies, and of international banking institutions to aid in investment and development of backward areas. That gives you, obviously, the Bretton Woods meeting, and then the three institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the GATT. So, this is a quote from the great historian Giovanni Arrighi, who recently died. In all previous world monetary systems, including the British, he says, the circuits and networks of high finance have been firmly in the hands of private bankers and financiers who organized and managed them with a view to making profit. World money was thus a byproduct of profit-making activities. It was like an accident of the business operations. In the world monetary system established at Bretton Woods, in contrast, the production of world money was taken over by a network of governmental organizations motivated primarily by considerations of welfare, security, and power. In principle, the IMF and the World Bank. In practice, the U.S. Federal Reserve System, acting in concert with the central banks of the closest and most important of U.S. allies. World money thus became a byproduct of state-making activities. As Henry Morgenthau put it in 1945, the security and monetary institutions of the New World Order were as complementary as the blades in a pair of scissors. So you can get a little more deeply into the detail of what was shown in that map, where it showed the United States of America, the United States of Latin America, the United States of Europe, etc. This is the detail of these institutions that I'm showing here, and the technological detail to make that a reality is building up in the work on, cybernetics. What's being described here is the post-war order lasting until the early 1970s. Of course, world money is clearly no longer in the hands of governments. This is exactly what we're seeing. So what I'm trying to show you is the previous situation so that we can really understand the crisis and how we arrive at the contemporary situation. Now let's see now what I want to do now is to try to give you an impression of the kind of person who could inhabit these institutions, coming out of the Second World War and becoming a technocratic manager. So I want to present the figure of the technocratic planner. I was sitting around, scratching my head, trying to figure out who could instantiate this figure, and I remembered exactly who it is, and there was a film about this guy. His name is Robert McNamara, an amazing figure who was successively the president of the Ford Motor Corporation, First he worked in the war, you'll hear about that. Then he was the president of Ford Motor Corporation. Then he was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, and the man who oversaw the policy of the Vietnam War, and following that, he was the president of the World Bank. So this guy really sums up the figure of the technocratic planner. I've taken a short excerpt from the film called The Fall of the War, and it starts with how his family life was interrupted by a great event of which he will tell you a story.
At the end of the year, we had our first child. The delivery costs were $100, and we paid that $10 a month. Those were some of the happiest days of our lives. And then the war came. I'd been promoted to assistant professor. I was the youngest assistant professor at Harvard. Annual salary, by the way, of $4,000 a year. Our women's schools market was drying up. The males were being drafted or volunteering. So the dean, being farsighted, brought back a government contract to establish an officer candidate school for what was called statistical control in the Air Force. We said to the Air Force, look, we're not going to take anybody you send up here. We're going to select the people. You have a punch card for every human being brought into the Air Corps. We're going to run those punch cards through the IBM sorting machines, and we're going to sort on age, education, accomplishment, grades, etc. We were looking for the best of the brightest. The best brains, the greatest capacity to lead, the best judgment. The U.S. was just beginning to bomb. We were bombing by daylight. The loss rate was very, very high. So they commissioned a study. And what did we find? We found the abort rate was 20%. 20% of the planes that took off from England to bomb targets in Germany turned around before they got to the target. Well, that was a hell of a mess. We lost 20% of our capability right there. A form, I think, was called Form 1A or something like that. It was a mission report. And if you aborted the mission, you had to write down why. So we get all these things and we analyze them. And we finally concluded it was baloney. They were aborting out of fear because the loss rate was 4% per sortie. The combat tour was 25 sorties. Didn't mean 100% were going to be killed, but a hell of a lot of them were going to be killed. They knew that, and they found reasons to not go over the target. So we reported this. One of the commanders was Curtis LeMay, colonel in command of a B-24 group. He was the finest combat commander of any service I came across in the war, but he was extraordinarily belligerent. Many thought brutal. He got the report. He issued an order. He said, I will be in the lead plane on every mission. Any plane that takes off will go over the target, or the crew will be court-martialed. The abort rate dropped overnight. Now that's the kind of a commander he was. You lost your wingman. It hurts me as much as it does you. I sent him there. And I've been there, I know what it is. But you lost one wingman and we destroyed Tokyo. "50 square miles, Tokyo were burned. Tokyo was a wooden city, and when we dropped these fire bombs, and it just burned it.
see here is the figure of subjectivity in the encounter with power, a particular form of power, the form that was forged in the crucible of what Pickering calls the World War II regime. And this is obviously a subjectivity characteristic of the ambition to a totally rational management of people and of space. I think it's worth, I think this is a great film for that, for showing that. It shows, in a way, the way that most of what we think of as human can disappear in the encounter with the kind of rationalizing forces that you were talking about before. And in that sense, it kind of provides, it gives a body, flesh to the discourses that I've just been developing, and it can serve as a point of reference when we try to understand the form of subjectivity and indeed the encounter between subjectivity and power that constitutes the world that we live in today. So I've set this up as a kind of marker for that. And on the basis of that and what I've just said, I now want to kind of rapidly examine, before we take a break, what led to the crisis of that form of power. So if we consider that that form of power took this vast innovation machine and tried to make it stable under the general framework of the cybernetic epistemology, which took the initially medical concept of homeostasis developed by a physiologist named Cannon and turned it into really the telos, the end, the finality of a technoscientific government. So this guy is a cyberneticist named Ashby who created a machine called the homeostat, which consisted of there's magnetic coils in there, and there's a magnet which is balanced in a force field, and there's 4 of them, and they move in sync. And when you send a signal in that disrupts one of them, what the machine does is find a new stability. So it takes a situation of instability and turns it into stability. And this was a model which became the model of this rationalist planning state that was the American state that emerged out of World War II and that took over from the British Empire. And I think there's an amazing book by a guy named Karl Deutsch, who despite his name was actually a Hungarian who emigrated to the United States, called The Nerves of Government, which develops the cybernetic theories directly into a logic of government. And this is kind of the mold in which the post-war period unfolded, with this logic of government and this figure of the technocratic planner. If we move on from there, we could consider what it was like to actually be in a factory, to be in a Fordist factory, subject to these processes of rational control, to be a worker who's fixed to jobs whose positions are determined by the configuration of a vast machine system, which is the system of the factory, continually monitored by engineers and so on. The workers are unable to put up any individual resistance to the imposition of the output norm because all their job autonomy has been abolished. Far-reaching transformations of the technical division of labor give an enormous boost to productive activity and demand social conditions that are specific to this mass circulation of commodities. So you have a fragmentation of tasks, everyone doing a small thing, and all integrated into this machine system. So this is ways to describe what it was like to actually be in this place. That sounded like that, that looked like that, that moved like that, where you're subject to uniform but always increasing pace of work, combined with the curtailment of resting time, which has the effect of increasing fatigue and creating new forms of nervous exhaustion, from which it's really impossible to recover from one day to the next. So symptoms of this modern form of destruction of human capacities are multiplied during the course of the 1960s, especially in the most mechanized industries. A high level of absenteeism and an irregular level that defies any attempt at prediction, an increase in temporary disabilities precipitated by the accumulation of nervous exhaustion, a rise in accidents on the assembly line, an increase in defective products, and consequently in time for quality control. So Alietta is trying to point to all the difficulties that the Fordist system, that this kind of imposition of a technocratic planning caused for the people who actually had to be its operational subjects, the workers. And I think the most extraordinary response to this actually happened in the city of Detroit, where, as you may or may not know, there was a rebellion in 1967, a huge uprising, the biggest one in the United States. It was not one of the series of revolts that occurred after the death of Martin Luther King, but it was rather generated directly out of the industrial conditions of Ford's city, the city that gave birth to the Fordist industrial pattern, Detroit. There's been a fantastic film made out of that, which is called Finally Got Your News, which is worth seeing. I can also put it into the archive, and which gives you a kind of energy of this, drawing on Diego Rivera's murals in the introduction, trying to kind of illustrate the intensity of, that's Ford himself right there, the intensity of the industrial process, this kind of blazing hot metal, this nervous exhaustion that you face when you're in such environments, and then illustrating both the explosion that occurred as a result of this and the kinds of militant work that principally black people tried to undertake after that explosion. They say after these moments of the revolt, when some 70 people were killed, a very strong moment in American history, which resulted in ultimately in the devastation of Detroit, which is now a depopulated city where the majority of the buildings look like that today, and is in fact the only city I've ever been to in the United States where I don't feel like I'm in America. Because, why? Because almost all the white people left, and the capital actually left the city. What you find in the city are the ruins of Fordist industrialism. And the whole Keynesian promise disappeared here into a rebellion when people finally got the news. That's the point of the film. Jim Morrison, political prisoner because he was trying to smuggle pot over the border from Canada to pay for the production of this film. It was a collaboration between this group of film producers from New York and effectively the Black League of Revolutionary Workers. Amazing film, really amazing film. This is the point where you start to move outside the welfare state. It's really, I think, the Detroit Rebellion in 1968 marked the end of the possibility for that kind of technocratic management. David Harvey's written this great book on the condition of postmodernity, where he describes the problems that we're building up. You know, the serious problems of Fordism that really, in retrospect, you could see that they were already there by the mid-1960s. The West European and Japanese recoveries were complete, so their internal markets were saturated. It was no longer possible to sell so many cars. Japan and Europe were both producing huge amounts of cars and other consumer goods. Declining corporate profitability after 1966 meant the beginnings of a fiscal problem in the United States that would not go away except at the price of inflation. In other words, they could no longer raise the tax to pay for all that welfare state that was necessary to keep the Keynesian promise alive. Import substitution policies in the third world countries, especially Latin America. That means that under social democratic impulse, the Latin American countries try to produce their own things and refuse to buy the American products so they could develop their own societies rather than simply being the recipient of U.S. production. Along with a push by multinationals into offshore manufacturing, particularly in Southeast Asia, brought a sort of wave of competitive Fordist industrialization to new environments all over the world. So you had a multiplication of this capacity for industrial mass production. And that's what David calls an overaccumulation crisis. corporations found themselves with unusable excess capacity, idle plant and equipment. This forced them into a period of rationalization, restructuring, and further intensification of labor control. Technological change, automation, the search for new product lines and market niches, geographical dispersal to zones of easier labor control, mergers and steps to accelerate the turnover time of capital, surge to the fore of corporate strategy for survival under conditions of deflation. In other words, now we're in the crisis of the 70s, the last big economic crisis, which is, in a way, what we're headed for now. We're now headed for the next big economic crisis. Huh? And things change at that time. So Kastel's, and what I think is Kastel's best book, not his trilogy on the networks, but this one, The Informational City, Manuel Castells writes, modes of development, we talked about this yesterday, these entire paradigms that come together in a regulation, that the French say, modes of development emerge from the interaction between scientific and technological discovery and their organizational integration in processes of production and management. The transition between one mode of development and another is not independent of the historical context. It relies heavily on the social matrix initially framing the transition, as well as the social conflicts and interests that shape the transformation of that matrix. Therefore, the informational mode of development will emerge from the interaction between its technological and organizational components and the historically determined process of restructuring of capitalism. That means that in the crisis you have a new crucible. And in this crucible, you have, of course, technological and organizational factors at play, but you also have social and cultural ones, and further geopolitical ones. And that crucible, from that crucible emerges a new form of society and, of course, a new form of subjectivity, which is basically our subjectivity. And so what's really interesting is you can only understand why it was a crisis if you look back to that rationalist, technocratic, planner state that emerged from World War II. And if you look back to the intensity of cybernetic control in its first order form, if you have looked at that, you can then begin to understand where we come from, which is the refusal of that and its metamorphosis into another system. And while the refusal of that was an incredibly inventive time, we now live in another system which is becoming as inoperative as this system was in 1967. That's the fascinating thing, is that we are living in history, not just looking at it from a distance. We are traversed by these processes. Now, what I want to stress again before we take this break is that in these moments, the elites go into action. Something incredible was done, which was this Trilateral Commission was founded in July 1973 at the instigation of David Rockefeller and chaired by Zbigniew Brzezinski. It was funded by Rockefeller, Kettering, and Ford Foundations. Founding members included Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan. 27 Trilateral Commission members were included in Jimmy Carter's government. David Rockefeller at the time was chairing the Council on Foreign Relations that had such influence during World War II. What's happening here is an expansion of the Council on Foreign Relations to a much larger space. The space of North America, Europe, and Japan. That was precisely the space that had received the Fordist industrial pattern and that had encountered its problems. So a change in scale occurs here. This change in scale, very interestingly, this actually was precipitated by this guy, Brzezinski, who was a major statesman, major American statesman. And he wrote an essay in 1968, after the month of May, which is an incredible thing to read. It's called Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. And the most interesting parts, it became a book, but the most interesting parts are the essay he wrote directly after 68. So he writes, he's trying to figure out, why did this chaos occur? Why did 68 happen? And you can see between the lines that he's afraid of it. He says, while our immediate reality is being fragmented, global reality increasingly absorbs the individual, involves them, and occasionally even overwhelms them. So this is a new scale, global reality. The changes wrought by communication and computers make for an extraordinarily interwoven society whose members are in continuous and close audiovisual contact, constantly interacting, instantly sharing the most intense social experiences, and prompted to increase personal involvement even in the most distant problems. The new generation no longer defines the world exclusively on the basis of reading, either of ideologically structured analyses or of extensive descriptions. It also experiences and senses vicariously through audiovisual communications. Why does he say that? Because 68 spread across the globe in a matter of weeks. And this was something that had not been seen in that way. It had been seen, say, in 1948 at the European level, but it had never been seen on the world level. And it spread through the televisions. And this is what shocked Brzezinski and caused him to write this essay. So he then quotes some authority. By 1985, distance will be no excuse for delayed information from any part of the world to the powerful urban nerve centers that will mark the major concentrations of people on Earth. Global telephone dialing, that in the more advanced states will include instant visual contact, and a global television satellite system that will enable some states to invade private homes in other countries, will create unprecedented global intimacy. Of course, he was totally right about this. He continues, the new reality, however, will not be a global village. McLuhan's striking analogy overlooks the personal stability, interpersonal intimacy, implicitly shared values and traditions that were important ingredients of the primitive village. A more appropriate analogy is that of the global city, a nervous, agitated, tense, and fragmented web of interdependent relations. Think about the kids in London with their BlackBerries setting fire to the buildings. That interdependence is better characterized by interaction than by intimacy. Instant communications are already creating something akin to a global nervous system. Occasional malfunctions of this nervous system, because of blackouts or breakdowns, will be all the more unsettling precisely because mutual confidence and reciprocally reinforcing stability will be absent from the process of nervous interaction. Television has joined newspapers in expanding the immediate horizons of the viewer or reader to the point where local increasingly means national, and global affairs compete for attention on an unprecedented scale. Physical and moral immunity to foreign events cannot be very effectively maintained under circumstances in which there are both a growing intellectual awareness of global interdependence and the electronic intrusion of global events into the home. I read that a few months ago and I thought, what a description of the world that we're living in, that he saw in 1968. And it seems to me that if the Council on Foreign Relations was expanded and transformed to become the Trilateral Commission, I think this is not a conspiracy theory. I can go to their website, I can download his books. It is because of this shock that came with the transformation of scale that had been building up through Fordist modernization. And then when satellite TV started to become online, remember 1968 is the year, actually 1969, the year that the internet was first connected, the ARPANET, this kind of technological shock was produced. And the result was the realization that world affairs would now have to be governed not only from the United States, but through a coalition in which US power would be relativized and inserted into a larger structure. That larger structure obviously could not be a formal government. The Trilateral Commission is not a formal body. It's a kind of a club. It is a private institution which gathers members from, principally from, at the time it was exclusively from North America, Europe, and Japan. Now it still exists and it's being expanded to China, India, and whatever. But in my opinion, what will happen now is that a new elite formation will be created because this one's epistemology will not be capable of managing the crisis that's presently unfolding. So it's very interesting to see these. It was necessary for them to create this new institution in 1973, and I am certain that if there's an outcome of this crisis, and of course there will be, it will include the creation of new elite institutions, which obviously will either be fundamentally transnational or we will live in an entirely different world, which will surely involve a gigantic war. So, and that's actually not really to be expected, although it's on everyone's mind all the time, of course. Of course it is. Now, there is a crisis of international cooperation, in other words. This I think I won't read because it becomes too long, but what they're trying to say is conditions have changed. We have to now deal with a much more complex reality, and this complex reality can only be dealt with if we set up an institutionality that is not directly and formally political in the frame of the nation state, but rather brings together elite actors from across the transnational realm. Those elite actors will include sociologists. They will include, in some philosophers even, obviously technocrats, politicians who are not in office. The idea is that there should be no serving politician, but former and future politicians are of course included. Corporate officers, bankers, obviously, and even religious figures. Those are the basic population that they aimed at. They always have these reports drafted by major sociologists and economists, and there are a whole series of these reports which you can consult on the website, which actually make pretty fascinating reading. You know, they point out the importance of the European community, and they point out obviously the importance of Japan in this crisis of international cooperation. And then you get this thing, which is famous which is a famous report called The Crisis of Democracy. And we're three rapporteurs, Michel Crozier, so a French sociologist, a Japanese guy whose name is Watanabe, I believe, whose thing I can never really understand very well because I don't know Japanese society so well. And then, it must be said, a son of a bitch named Samuel Huntington, who wrote these sentences which no one has able to forget ever since. He says, the vigor of democracy in the United States in the 1960s contributed to a democratic distemper, involving the expansion of governmental activity on the one hand and the reduction of governmental authority on the other. Some of the problems of governance in the United States today stem from an excess of democracy. An excess of democracy in much the same sense in which David Donald used the term to refer to the consequences of the Jacksonian Revolution, which helped to precipitate the Civil War. As you can see, they're worried about this excess of democracy. Huh? Needed, instead, is a greater degree of moderation in democracy. In many situations, the claims of expertise, seniority, experience, and special talents may override the claims of democracy as a way of constituting authority. The effective operation of a democratic political system usually requires some measure of apathy and non-involvement on the part of some individuals and groups. The American political system has emerged as a distinctive case of extraordinarily democratic institutions joined to an exclusively democratic value system. Democracy is more of a threat to itself in the United States than it is in either Europe or Japan. We have come to recognize that there are potentially desirable limits to economic growth. There are also potentially desirable limits to the indefinite extension of democracy. You can see here the crucible from which neoconservatism emerged. You can see here the backdrop of anxiety about the capacity to control the development of a democracy that gave rise to many, many of the policies that we now associate with the muted, diluted, apathetic, non-participative sort of spectacular societies, if you will, of the electronic era, and all the forms of, how shall I say, of distraction that exist to, in a way, keep people from the kind of democratic involvement that actually terrified people on the left, on the democratic side, like Brzezinski, or on the right, like Huntington. And so I think it's quite interesting to see how such groups operate, because it might be possible, and this I think is something that intellectuals like ourselves ought to be able to do. It might be possible to see these things developing now, if we learn to use eyes and ears that we do not yet have. Because in the next coming years, we're obviously confronted with a crisis on the scale of the one I've just described. And there will obviously be reactions like this. So the question is, who and in what form will be the reactions, and the even more urgent questions is, in what form will take the revolts and proposals for not a diminished democracy, but for a more real democracy, which is clearly what we're going to need and what many people thought at the time. Okay, apparently now we have to take a break because it's already 6. Let's take a short break, and then we will reach then the definition of financialization, and that will be enough for today.